Good morning, everybody. My name is John Joseph. I'd like to thank you folks for coming out and joining us here this morning. Today's first speaker and our keynote for this session is Captain Kevin Haight. He's going to be talking about 911, what's our emergency. I'm going to be moderating today's session. I will want to remind everybody that we are recording these sessions, so as we're going through and hopefully we can record all of this for posterity. I even told Captain Haight I was going to say nice things about him. Before we get started, if you do have questions, if there's any kind of chat you want to throw out there, please use the little chat window down here at the bottom of the Q&A session. I'll be monitoring that as we're going through. We're going to kind of reserve questions towards the end, and hopefully we'll get a few of those that we can go through and interact with Captain Haight on at the end of the session. So I'd like to introduce Captain Haight. With over 21 years of service to the Idaho State Patrol, Captain Haight has been a proven leader within our industry, and particularly for us within our state. I've had the honor of working alongside of him through the Idaho Untitled Chapter. I know that one of the things I really admire most about Captain Haight is his commitment, his passion for 911. I feel like if there's a cause, he fights for it. If there's a need, he defends it. He's just an awesome stand-up guy, and I really am glad I get a chance to introduce you all to him. Captain Haight actually serves here in the state of Idaho on the Idaho Public Safety Communication Committee. He chairs the Idaho PSAP Standards and Training Committee. He, like I said, sits on the board with me on the APCO-NENA board, and he's really led efforts in our state that have been things like getting post-certification for our dispatchers available online so that a portion of our training can be done remotely without having to travel for all of that training. And he was talking about this long before there's such a thing as COVID. He's been working on these things. So, he really is a leader in our state. He's helped get things started like the Denise Amber Lee Foundation here in this state. Works very closely with Kyle Plush. He's just really kind of given us this opportunity to have somebody that we can turn to at state level and help us. He recently completed his master's degree in security studies from the Naval Postgraduate School, and his paper that he wrote from that, or his thesis from that, was about 911. And so I wanted to invite him to come in and be our keynote speaker and share his message with all of you. So Captain Haight, welcome.
Well, thank you, John. Are you talking about me with all of that?
I was.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, John. And thank you, Datamark, for this opportunity. And good morning, everybody from the East Coast clear out to the Pacific Northwest and everybody in between. I consider this a huge honor and privilege, particularly during this week of National Public Safety Telecommunicators Week. 27 years ago, President Clinton formalized this week by beginning the process of an annual proclamation for National Public Safety Telecommunicators Week to be the second week of April every year, year after year. And here we are this week celebrating, honoring the heroes of the headset. And I look forward to this conversation over the next 45 minutes to an hour and sharing with you some of what's on my heart and on my mind as a result of my research. And so with that, let's get started. As you can see, my title of my research, my thesis, is a provocative title, and that is intentional. Most of you that work for Emergency Dispatching Center, when a call comes in, you answer that call with some iteration of 911, what's your emergency, or what's, something along that line, or where's your emergency? This research has to do with what is going on internal to 911 that really needs to change. And so let's just dive into it. I became a state trooper in 1999. And I have had a very fulfilling and rewarding career. I have always admired and appreciated our emergency dispatch profession. But I really didn't understand the profession, the job, the stresses of the job, all of the nuances of the job, until as a lieutenant, I moved into the emergency dispatching program within our agency and became responsible for its operation, eventually becoming a captain over emergency dispatch. And here's what I will tell you. On October of 2015, I had the opportunity to sit in a class put on in Pocatello, Idaho. And during that class, I heard about this young mother from South Florida with two young boys who was cutting their hair on the back porch of their semi-rural home, and her husband was off to work making a living. They were happy. They were newlyweds. Everything was bright. They had the most exciting future to look forward to, and they were living life to its very fullest. When out of nowhere, a animal, Michael King, stalking what is believed to be a young high school girl, diverted his attention from that young high school girl, we believe, and spotted Denise on the back porch cutting her boy's hair. It was opportunistic for him. He kidnapped her, left the boys in the house, and for several hours after that, he brutally raped her, bound her, and eventually murdered her. And I sat and listened to that training put on by Nathan, her husband, widower. And I had sympathy for him. I had empathy for what had occurred. I felt sick to my stomach. But the thing that hit me the most, sitting there as a program manager for emergency dispatching and as a cop, was the fact that Denise was a cop's daughter. I have three daughters, three beautiful girls. And after listening to that training, I said to myself, this can never happen again. This is inexcusable. Many of you know the story of Denise Amber Lee, and many of you have been changed the same way I have. But that's what gave me the passion. And it really revolved around the fact that even though Michael King is the one that is guilty, convicted, and actually sentenced to death for this heinous crime, it is the dysfunction, unprepared, undertrained, incapable emergency dispatching center where her dad, Sergeant Rick Goff, worked. He worked at that agency. It was that dispatch center that botched this call. There were police officers, multiple officers that were in close range of intercepting her in her final moments when 911 calls were coming in, not only from her, but from other witnesses. And there were officers in the area that could have intercepted and stopped her horrific nightmare. But because of incompetence, it didn't happen. And I sat through that training and said, you know, this just can't happen anymore. And it's got to stop. So that's what gave me the passion. I admire and respect all of you. And so as we talk about National Public Safety Telecommunicators Week for just a moment, I do want to say thank you. Thank you to every single one of you for the horrific things that you have to listen to, for the memories that you'll never be able to erase, for the screams of panic from those callers when they're in the middle of a nightmare. Thank you for the sleepless nights. Thank you for being called in when there's a short staffing situation. Thank you for the birthdays that you missed, the holidays that you missed or postponed. Thank you for all of those things. You are too often forgotten, and unfortunately, a lot of times it's because of my profession and fire, EMS, that we don't give you enough praise, the kind of praise that you really deserve. And I feel awful about that, and I want to tell you thank you for what you do. As we go through this presentation, I want to start this off by also letting you know that I understand that the conditions I'm going to talk about here shortly does not represent every single center across the United States. You do a profound work. Incredibly professional folks work in our ECCs or our PSAPs across this country. And I am one of your biggest fans and one of your biggest supporters. And so thank you for that as well. But the reality is, while there is outstanding services and you are highly appreciated and admired, the 911 system in our country needs an intervention of the status quo. So my research revolved around this question: how could the nation's 911 system, and specifically its emergency communications officer occupation or public safety telecommunicator occupation, evolve to address problems and maximize advantages to public safety and, frankly, Homeland Security? If you think about Homeland Security for a minute, any major Homeland Security event that's occurred in this country, let's your mind go back to 9/11, for example, or Hurricane Katrina, or Columbine, any major Homeland Security incident, all of those are almost always, if not always, initiated where? At the 911 center. Those initial calls are coming into 911, and that's where the response efforts and everything that happens after that is all initiated at, coordinated from. And so you do truly sit at the spear, at the tip of the spear when it comes to provisioning of public safety and Homeland Security. So I looked at really 8 problem statements that I addressed in my research, and I have those delineated out here for you. They revolved around these eight issues. The first one is that there is far too much anecdotal evidence for a need for mandated professionalization and standardization within emergency dispatch profession. And I will get into that a little bit further as we get into this presentation. Number 2, and this is real dominant in all of our minds right now, is the misclassification of the public safety telecommunicator, or here in Idaho, the emergency communications officer, by the Office of Management and Budget. As you know, they classify the position right now in a secretarial or clerical occupation, rather than in the protective service occupations group. Number 3, 911 is under duress as a result of antiquated technologies and funding scarcity. We're not investing enough in 911 nationally. And in fact, too many jurisdictions, point number 4, are pilfering those 911 fees. And when I say jurisdictions for this presentation, I'm not talking about your agency. I'm not talking about my agency. For this context, I'm talking about states and U.S. territories. So there are states and U.S. territories that are pilfering 911 fees, using those fees to fill potholes in roads, using those fees to buy garbage trucks. The list is long. And the research is actually easy to find if you start Googling what the FCC has said about this very issue year over year over year, extending literally 10, 12, 15 years back. And there are a number of states that are repeat offenders with doing this, unfortunately. Problem statement number 5, there's a large number of jurisdictions that do not require professionalization standards. And again, jurisdictions, I mean states or territories. When I talk about professionalized standards, I am specifically referencing 4 categories, and there may be more, but I specifically focus on these 4. Hiring standards, or what I refer to as character standards. For example, here in Idaho, and in most states, if not all states, you cannot be a police officer if there are certain things in your background that you participated in at some point in your past. That's what I'm talking about. You know, if you are guilty of any kind of a felony in Idaho, whether he's a juvenile or an adult, you can never be a sworn police officer. And because Idaho has pretty robust hiring or character standards for emergency dispatchers, the same goes for them. So that's what I'm talking about. The second is mandated minimum training standards. Just like police officers that have to receive mandated minimum training in all of our states and territories and have to maintain that, I'm talking about the same thing for our emergency dispatchers. Next is continuing education requirements. Those should be mandated. And then lastly, emergency medical dispatching protocols. And we'll dive into this a little bit more here shortly. Number 6, emergency communications officers serve at the tip of public safety or Homeland Security. Mandated professionalization and standardization should be obvious, and frankly, it should be pervasive. We're in the 21st century, folks. And unfortunately, as you'll see here in a little bit, we have a long ways to go as a nation when it comes to professionalization and standardization of our emergency dispatching profession across this country. Number 7, ambiguous terms may be a hindrance. Notice I say maybe, but this is an opinion issue with me. You've heard me this morning already refer to public safety telecommunicators as emergency dispatchers or emergency communications officers. I am pretty fond of the latter, emergency communications officers. That is the term that we use here in the state of Idaho. It is in statute. It is what their certification is. Our governor's proclamation for this week, relative to National Public Safety Telecommunicators Week, his proclamation actually calls it National Emergency Communications Officer Week. So here in Idaho, that's the term we use. But in terms of what I mean here with ambiguous terms, you already know the industry is moving away from PSAP, Public Safety Answering Point, towards ECC, or Emergency Communications Centers, for this very reason. And I submit to you that we should do the same in terms of the profession. Move away from public safety telecommunicator to something that's more inclusive of what the job actually entails, such as emergency communications officer. I scratch my head and wonder what is truly a telecommunicator. I understand the words public safety in front of that give it some clarity. But why didn't they call you all CAD communicators? Why didn't they call you all radio communicators? Telecommunicator isn't a word. If you type it in a Word document, you get a misspelling notation. And you guys know better than I do. You do far, far more than telecommunicate. So it's just not an inclusive term. It's not an actual word. And I don't think it really elevates the profession. If you ask somebody out on the street if they know what a telecommunicator is, you're probably going to get all kinds of answers. Now, if you throw public safety telecommunicator in front of it, that may help drill down on it a little bit, and some folks may give you some semblance of emergency dispatching or 911 or something like that. But I just think that we could use better terms in our industry. And I would submit to you, we already are. What about CTO, Communications Training Officer? We've been using that in the industry for years. So we use an elevating term for that particular specialty within emergency dispatching, Communications Training Officer. But yet we're using a very ambiguous term for the entry level or the line level position, and I am not a fan. And then lastly, number 8, emergency communication centers are plagued by systemic challenges with recruitment and retention of skilled and career-minded emergency dispatchers. This isn't news to any of you. I'll tell you, boy, just Google attrition rates or attrition problems or retention or recruitment problems in 911, and you will get thousands of hits of articles, stories, research. The list is large, how this is a systemic problem nationally. Why is it a problem? Well, I'm going to dive into that a little bit more. So first, the job classification issue. Is it clerical or is it protective? Well, let me give you a little bit of understanding of how it probably landed in clerical initially. And unfortunately, has never left that. Way back before 911 existed, in fact, way back before phones were really even available, communities had what they called town criers. And those town criers would run up and down the streets listening for citizens who were calling out for help. And if they would hear that, they were the ones responsible to summons the volunteers, the public safety servants, to go and assist with that person in need of help. And then obviously, as time evolved and technologies evolved and needs became apparent, phones came online and those kinds of things, you ended up with telephone operators. And initially, when somebody needed an emergency service of some kind, they would just dial the normal phone operator. And then that phone operator was responsible to summon the police, fire, so on. And then back in 1968 is when 911 actually officially was initiated. And in those early days, 911 really was nothing more than the conduit, the connection. It was the caller calling in, asking for help, the 911 operator collecting the important information, the who, what, where, when, and then disseminating it to the public safety service to respond. You all know, as well as I do, probably frankly better than I do, how much the job has made a massive shift since 1968. Unfortunately, Office of Management and Budget has never coincided that massive shift in job tasks with the classification. There was an effort to do so that began back in 2014, and it ran through about 2017. It had bicameral support of both the U.S. House and Senate. It had bipartisan support. It had public safety industry support. It had our National Association support. It failed. Office of Management and Budget refused to move you all from the dispatcher public safety telecommunicator title currently housed under Office of Administrative Support occupation. They refused to move it. They refused to move it over to the Protective Service Occupations Group. And the interesting thing about that is when we talk about public or Protective Service occupation, that doesn't just include police officers or firefighters or EMS folks. Look at it. It includes security guards. It includes crosswalk guards. It includes school bus monitors. If it includes those folks in protected service classification or occupation, how in the world can it not include our emergency dispatching profession? It doesn't. Their rebuttal or their refusal to do so was enshrined in these 6 excuses. Number one, they asserted that work performed is that of a dispatcher, not first responder. Well, that implies that what the emergency dispatcher does is not that dissimilar from what a tow truck dispatcher does, or a taxi cab dispatcher does, or a utility company dispatcher does. That's the implication here, is that it's not that dissimilar from those. Very ignorant thinking. Number two, emergency communications officer is normally precluded from administering actual care. Okay, that's very interesting, especially now since COVID and since the pandemic, because how many of you have actually had telehealth care? That's viewed as care. It's been widely viewed as care over the last year. But if you provide any kind of care over the phone to the callers, apparently that's not care. Interesting. Number three, the emergency communications officer is normally precluded from talking to someone through procedures. Really? What's EMD, right? Number four, the emergency communications officer is normally precluded from providing advice. Again, very short-sighted, very misinformed, and just flat wrong. And I'll dive into this a little bit more here very shortly as well. Number five, separating the emergency communications officer from the other non-public safety dispatcher professions would be confusing. Confusing to who? And since when is public confusion a reason for not putting a job in a classification that it really belongs in? And then lastly, number six, the emergency communications officer has a different supervisory chain from the protective service occupation group. So in my research, I looked at this. There is approximately 5,748 emergency communication centers. That's primary PSAPs or primary centers and secondary centers in the United States, including US territories. So just shy of 6,000. Of those, there's approximately 4,500 of those that are directly owned, operated, funded by police agencies, and that means highway patrol, state patrol, city police departments, county sheriff's departments, tribal police departments, fire departments, and EMS agencies. Literally almost 4,600 of those, or 79% of those, are owned and operated and at some level overseen by those first responder or those field responder organizations. Here's another little side note that I thought was very interesting and cropped up during my research. The Office of Management and Budget, when you look at air traffic controllers, because I consider the emergency communications officer as the air traffic controller of the public safety disciplines. They really are, if you think about it. So I looked at where do they classify air traffic controllers? Well, it was very interesting because guess where they have them at? They have them in the transportation and materials moving occupation. That's with baggage handlers, that's with pilots, that's with train conductors, That's with truck drivers, forklift operators. That's where air traffic controllers are. Well, air traffic controllers aren't flying airplanes. They aren't unloading baggage, but they're part of the infrastructure of transportation, right? But 911 isn't part of the infrastructure of protective service? Interesting. So what are some counter arguments to their rebuttal, to the Office of Management and Budget's rebuttal? I looked at three categories. First, operational counter arguments. Second, environmental counter arguments. And third, political counter arguments. First, let's talk about operational counter arguments. I took one case from here in the state of Idaho. It actually was from Kootenai County Sheriff's Office up in northern Idaho, up in what we call the Panhandle, from back in 2018. This was a case of a woman who was driving down a windy, curvy state highway and for unknown reasons drove into the lake. Her car was sinking. She was panicked. She calls 911. She reaches the 911 or emergency communications officer, and that officer immediately kicks in using her EMD protocols or her agency protocols to include some of the EMD type protocols. And the first thing she established was the woman's location, that the woman wasn't injured, but that the car was sinking. So she gave her instructions. She asked her, can you swim? Yes, I can swim. How far are you from shore? The woman estimated her distance from shore. Explained to her to put her windows down, let the water start to come in the vehicle to equalize the pressure. Once the pressure is equalized, the door will open easily. You can exit, or you can go through the window, get up on the roof of the car. All of those kinds of things. That was the emergency communications officer that did all of that. By the time the field responders got to the scene, the caller was sitting on the shore, shook up, wet, distraught, but the emergency was over. And I can tell you, over 21 years of being a public servant out in the field, a field responder, time after time after time, that's been the actual case and calls I've responded to. Well, there was an emergency, but by the time I got there, the emergency part of it was essentially over. Now it was investigating it, cleaning up the mess, facilitating, processing the scene, but the emergency was over. And you and I both know who is directly responsible for helping that emergency mitigate to no longer being an emergency. It's the emergency dispatcher. So that is the operational side of it, where the Office of Management and Budget really doesn't connect the dots with how much the job has changed from what it used to be back in the 60s and 70s and even the 80s for what it is now. Secondly is the environmental factors. Next Gen 911, where you are going to be subjected to, and some of you may already be subjected to, incident-related imaging that's coming into your centers, where you now are not just processing auditory information, you will be processing visual information of what's going on in the field. That is going to bring a greater risk for what is called psychopathology, or ultimately PTSD, to your profession. If we as an industry do not pivot and address the kind of training and emotional support, psychological support, making sure that you are properly prepared for those kind of things that are coming your way. Something very, very different from what a record dispatcher will ever have to deal with, or a utility dispatcher, or a trucking company dispatcher. And then lastly is the political counter arguments to their rebuttal. All of you are probably quite familiar with 911 Saves Act. Unfortunately, it was introduced back a couple of years ago, and it just sat dormant. It didn't go anywhere. Exciting for all of us that it looks like it may have grown some legs again and may have the potential to actually happen this time. And we can all root for that and support that and speak out in support of that. And I have done that. I hope you have too. But how pathetic is it that it's going to take potentially a law mandating Office of Management and Budget to do what should be pervasively obvious to them that needs to be done? So it just speaks to the climate. It speaks to why there needs to be an intervention of the status quo. I said earlier, talking about National Public Safety Telecommunicators Week, how that was proclaimed by President Clinton 27 years ago. Okay, 27 years ago. What that means is we as a society honor and recognize and appreciate what you do, but our federal government hasn't put their money where their mouth is as it relates to the classification. We don't have a national records dispatcher week. We don't have a national trained dispatchers week. But we have a national public safety telecommunicators week because we're saying, look, these people have a thankless job. It's a tough job. Not everybody can do this job. We're saying it, but our actions aren't proving it. And quite frankly, my discipline, fire, EMS, are largely responsible for the apathy on this issue. Great segue into this slide, right? You know, apathy is married to indifference, and they live in the village of status quo, state of denial. It's pathetic that in 1998, a police chief from the state of Florida actually tried to get the state of Florida to institute hiring, training, continuing education standards for emergency dispatch. Literally 10 years before Denise's incident happened. And it was categorically shot down. It was shot down by his peers, his colleagues. Oh, we don't need this. There's no problem. We're trying to fix something that isn't broke. Just pathetic arguments. Apathy. I would also submit to you it's a bit of ego. I think the first responder or the field responder industries, unfortunately, have been paralyzed by a little bit of ego about this issue. They view it as you know, we're the field responders. We're the ones going to take the bullets. We're the ones going to fall through the roof. We're the ones possibly going to get physically harmed out there. And our peers of the headsets, you know, they're not. They're safe. Well, that's true. You're safe, generally speaking. However, it's very short-sighted of them to take that approach because as a field responder, we need our dispatchers to be paid well, trained well, benefited well, including retirement. I don't need a dispatcher sitting at a console in their declining years, which is just a physiological fact, even from my profession, right? When they can't hear as well, their multitasking skills aren't as good. That puts all of us at risk. So the public, field responders, all of us. So again, apathy and pathetic arguments. A couple of years ago, I was at one of the national conferences that will remain anonymous. But I was in the middle of my research for this thesis project, and I was sitting at a table with a group of folks from around the state, visiting, eating lunch, getting to know them, talking about my research. And an individual that was from the state of Minnesota and was a leader in a emergency communications center, or at least self-identified as a leader, made the comment to me, yeah, we don't really need mandated professionalization and standards. Minnesota doesn't have them, and we don't really need them. And I said, really? Why is that? Well, we use different CAD. We all use different CAD systems. We use different radio systems. We use different console furniture systems. We have different SOPs, different ways of handling different phone systems, different protocols that we use. So how do you standardize and professionalize? Well, I thought about that for a while, and I thought, you know, my discipline of law enforcement, and I didn't say this at the time, but I'm saying it now. My discipline, law enforcement, has mandated standards across this entire country. You have to be a sworn, certified, trained police officer. Well, we don't all shoot the same guns. We don't all drive the same cars. We don't all enforce the same laws. We don't all have the exact same policies and procedures and the same weapons that we wear on our duty belts in terms of non-lethal. We don't all have the same policies and procedures, but we have to meet a basic mandated professionalization and standard in every single state. And 911 should be absolutely no different. Another example of apathy and pathetic arguments is California. Professional Firefighters Association. This was about a year ago, where in California there was an effort to get the emergency dispatching profession reclassified, and I applaud a number of states around the country are doing this out in front of OMB, and that's awesome. There was an effort to do that and change some of the language that pigeonholed emergency dispatching in California. And the Professional Firefighters Association wrote this letter that was very eloquent, and it was very praiseworthy towards the emergency dispatching profession. They used terms like well-respected, dedicated professionals. Such professionals play critical roles in the overall emergency response system, comma, but. Comma, but. We all know what that means when you see comma, but. Now they're going to begin their pathetic arguments, and that's exactly what they did. Trying to make their arguments for why what the emergency dispatcher does isn't akin to what we do. No, it isn't, but it also isn't an us against them. It should be this is a team. It should be a team effort. These are part of our team. And then lastly, on the law enforcement side, the Police Executive Research Forum, known as PERF, to their credit, have actually been calling out the same kind of stuff I'm talking about today for several years. It's not gaining a lot of traction. I do think that the pendulum is shifting a little bit, but and I quote one thing here that they cite, and that is that emergency communications center services are relegated to subordinate and undervalued discipline within public safety. And it's so true. It's so true. And it needs to change in my discipline. It needs to change in fire's discipline. So funding paucity. What's causing funding paucity? Well, there's stress on the nation's 911 system that is increased due to inadequate financial investment and diminishing revenue streams. A number of states that have collected over $2.9 billion in 911 fees in 2017, but almost 10%, or approximately $285 million of those fees, were expended by certain states for non-911 purposes. And here is a list of some of the states that have been repeat offenders of this: Montana, New York, New Jersey, Nevada, Rhode Island, West Virginia, and U.S. Virgin Islands. So what's the current state of affairs? Well, I cite 3 anecdotal cases, anecdotal evidence in my thesis research. You and I both know there are far, far many more. unfortunately. The three I cite is the Denise Amber Lee case. The next one I cite is a case out of Massachusetts, the Laura Levis case, and that's a case where she was asthmatic. It was about 4 o'clock in the morning. She was having an asthma attack, tried walking from her apartment to her neighborhood hospital that had the emergency room doors locked because it was in the wee hours of the morning. She couldn't get in. She called 911. The initial call taker transferred her to another dispatch center without telling the other dispatch center that the caller told her she was outside the locked emergency room doors. The other emergency dispatcher didn't know that, sent first responders who went to other doors at the hospital before those doors, looking for her. By the time they found her, she was deceased. And then lastly, the Kyle Plush case out of the state of Ohio, which was just a horrific incident. And quite frankly, that's not just a 911 failure, that's also a law enforcement failure there. Both systems failed, resulting in his death. And unfortunately, public safety never found him. His father found him about 6 hours later. Pathetic. So there are initiatives underway to enhance technology and enhance processes and systems within 911, such as Next Gen 911, FirstNet. Yet, in 2020, for my research, these are the states that have a hiring standard. 21st century, and these are the only states that actually mandate that the emergency dispatch profession meets a hiring or a character standard. 11 of them. Only 28 of them require basic training standards, minimum basic training. And out of those 28, 2 of them, it is only required for primary PSAPs. It's not required for secondary dispatch centers. Only 23 require continuing education for the profession. 23, less than half, or right at half, counting US territories. And then only 24 require the use of protocols, specifically emergency medical dispatching protocols, which is where I focus. Only 24 out of 56 jurisdictions, and again, that includes US states and territories. We have a long ways to go, folks. Do you see why now I say that we need an intervention of the status quo? So when I talk about professionalization and standardization, it really is encapsulated in this figure here. It demonstrates exactly what I mean. And this is what happens for police. This happens for fire. It needs to look something like this, where there is a continuing of hiring or character standards. People are held to a standard. You know, if you're a police officer and you have a domestic violence charge against you, you're not a police officer anymore. Well, why would we want a dispatcher being a dispatcher anymore if they've had the same thing happen? They have access to ILETS information. They have access to other very important data about the public. And if they are participating in illegal activities, they shouldn't be in those seats anymore. It needs to include a basic training and continuing education requirement. It needs to be delineated with a certification or a licensing standard, such as Idaho and a number of other states have. And then there needs to be a required use of medical pre-arrival instructional protocols for any EMS dispatching type agencies. So this was a nugget that I bumped into, and I'm almost done here. This was a nugget I bumped into in my research. I had no idea that Finland is considered one of the safest countries in the world, and it also has one of the most robust, highly professionalized, and highly standardized 911 systems in the world. They've worked for over 28 years to achieve that. And while it's a federalized kind of a country and we're a states' rights kind of country, I don't call for in my research that we should model what Finland is doing exactly at a national level, but I do think that this is what we should do as states, each state and each territory. Finland, for example, has 6 emergency dispatch centers for their entire country. 6. That's one dispatching center for approximately 21,778 square miles. So how does that compare to the United States? Well, Finland is roughly the same geographical size as California. Population-wise, it's about the same size as Colorado in terms of population. Well, how many PSAPs or ECCs does California have, and how many does Colorado have? California has just shy of 500. Colorado, 104. So Finland has 6 for the entire country. Colorado has 104 for the same population base. This shows how fractured we are. This demonstrates why maybe we can't invest and afford the kind of enhancements and the kind of pay and the kind of benefits that really needs to happen because we're so fractured. We're so about kingdoms and castles. And all I do is point out the fact that our model, there is some solutions that are working very, very well that are very different from what our model is here in the United States. So what are my conclusions? First, the emergency communications officer work is protected. The OMB misclassifies your occupation, and its rebuttal arguments are unequivocally refutable. Second, these centers are highly challenged by systemic recruitment and retention of skilled and career-minded ECOs, and that is in large part because you are undervalued, undertrained, and undercompensated. And when I say compensated, I mean benefits too. Retirement benefits explicitly. So it's largely looked upon, the public safety industry is looked upon this way. I liken it to a stool where one of the legs is police, represented by the blue leg. That's law enforcement. The second leg of the stool is represented here with the red leg, and that would be fire. The third leg would be EMS. So police, fire, and EMS. I would submit to you that there's a lot of folks within the 911 emergency dispatching profession that try to argue that the fourth leg of the stool is missing. And the fourth leg is emergency dispatching. I disagree with that, but hang on. I don't think emergency dispatching is the fourth leg of this stool for public safety. I would submit to you that the emergency dispatching profession is the platform. It is the seat that holds the other three together. It is the platform that all of the other three rely upon. And quite frankly, it is the platform that our society rests upon to get the help that they need. This is really, in my mind, how this should look. And it should be a team effort. We should view all of this as the three-legged stool where 911 is the platform. Number 3, 911 is under duress. Antiquated technologies are causing that, funding paucity is causing that, and insufficient investment. Number 4, every jurisdiction should be mandating minimum training and certification standards. Public safety and policy leaders should be appalled. Number 5, organizations will need to pivot. They need to recognize the implications of next gen 911 and make sure that we're hiring people that have the knowledge, the skills, and the abilities to do the job going forward. And then not only that, but support them with proper care, mental health benefits, those kinds of things, including better pay and benefits. So we need to abandon the apathy and insincerity, especially in the field responder disciplines, and become part of a team of bringing your standards and your pay and benefits up to where it needs to be. It is a profoundly demanding job. It is consequential and pivotal to effective and efficient provision of public safety. We need to continue education efforts, embrace and adopt standardization and professionalization initiatives. OMB considers the emergency communications officer's work as clerical and akin to that of a taxi or tow truck driver, which is just pathetic. It's ignorant. We need to address incommensurate pay and benefits, enhance applicant screening, training, mental health benefits, and we need to demand better from our political and our policy leaders. Insufficient industry, disgust, to shame, thief, theft, intoxication, and that needs to stop. Use of 911 fees for expenditures unrelated to 911 leads to vulnerabilities and failures. And with that, I thank you for this opportunity. Again, my biggest sincere appreciation to each one of you for what you do. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. I love and admire you. I look up to all of you. Thank you for what you do. John, we have maybe a couple minutes for questions.
Yeah, it does look like we've got a couple of quick chat things in here. Just one of our folks just thanking you and what an awesome presentation this was. There's so much great information. I will say everything to the folks who are online right now. You know, we did record these sessions and we will be able to share those with you. And ideally, we'd love to have you guys get a chance to share this with others because we do think it's a very important message that we need to carry throughout this industry. So thank you so much for joining us today. And we're going to let you go ahead and take a break and grab some coffee and get ready for the next session, which starts here in about 4 minutes. Yeah, lots of thank yous, Kevin Haight. Lots of thank yous.
Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone. I hope you have a fantastic day.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We'll hopefully talk to you here again soon.